obviously signing Joseph Suaalii has been huge. When he got signed for 1.6, reportedly, who knows what it is.
What do you think it is?
Well, that's what everyone's saying about 1.6
1.6
for what? Not a year, for
a year.
It could
for
be
a year.
per year, which it's big money. But the Australian public were like, why aren't we investing in our youngsters? This is ridiculous. That they forget that he actually came through rugby. He played a rugby school. It was just that he got talent ID'd at school from the leagueies that were ahead of rugby at that point. Took him to league. He went super well, proved himself. They had the opportunity to buy him. I think Drew was saying 200,000. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, like you look at rugby league's got 17 professional teams in Australia. Right? In rugby union, we've got 4. So for them to go out and scout some of these guys at a school, it's very difficult for us to go and compete with the prices that they're wanting to pay a 16, 17-year-old kid that hadn't proved himself as an adult yet. And so, the powers to be at Rugby Australia didn't choose to pay $200,000 a year for him at 17 or 18, but we decided to wait 2 or 3 years and pay 1.6 for him.
Yeah, but still, but having someone like that, and then he performed well against England, got the excitement back. I think bringing him in, you've got Will Skelton coming in, Samu Karevi, these guys, they don't actually have to play well, but the presence that they bring and the confidence that they offer the other players, you can see the freedom that everyone's playing with. If they lose to Scotland, if they lose to Ireland, I still feel like 2 out of the 4 isn't too bad how we were looking beforehand. That England win was huge for us. But if we're able to win against Scotland, and even if we lost against Ireland, obviously I hope that we don't, but if we can beat Scotland and it builds that hype that we potentially win a Grand Slam tour, which hasn't been done since 1984. You think of all the great teams that we've had in Australian rugby leading up into that. It's just going to build so much buzz and excitement about the Lions and just get the Australian public, because we are fickle. We've got so many other sports that we can choose and support if one team's not going well. But if our national team's doing well, it's like back to those 2002 days where everyone's excited about it again.
A lot of Welsh listeners and Scottish listeners and English listeners will be listening to this and be watching Australia and where you were 12 months ago. And it seemed like it was irreparable, regardless of who you brought in. Okay, go and get Joe Schmidt like we did with Ireland, but there's no chance he'll turn it round. Drew, we're looking at it now as in he's come in and done a job and put you back at the top table. Like it could, hopefully not the weekend against Scotland, but it could happen.
Yeah.
That you could walk away from this and not be favourites, but it's more of an even keel for the Lions to come. How's he managed in that short space of time? Was it always there, or do you think that he's found this talent coming through, the lads have engaged with him?
If I could just quickly come in on that, purely because I ran into a couple of Wallaby players in Canberra after the tour, after the World Cup, and they bought into a game plan that Eddie Jones almost sold to them, like said, this may not win us the World Cup, but this is the way that we're going to play and it'll win us the World Cup in 2027. So you've got these players buying into a game plan, and we all know what it's like. If you've got a game plan you don't believe in, you're playing half-hearted. You're also playing with fear because you know you're going to get screamed at potentially if you do something off script. To now, and then obviously Eddie walks away, so these players feel betrayed in a massive sense, to now with a game plan that they believe in, a game plan that they trust, and they're playing with freedom. Like Lenny Flickertower at the end of the game. To win a game, if you're coached by Eddie Jones, I believe that if he was coached by Eddie, he doesn't do that offload. You're going to hold it, conserve, build phases.
Try and go for the penalty. Yeah.
Try and go for the penalty or just find a different way. Whereas now they feel like they're playing with freedom and the shackles are off. And that's where you get the enjoyment. So I feel like that's been the biggest difference is they've got a game plan that they believe in. And if you believe in something, you'll commit 100%. And once you commit 100%, right or wrong, you're going to get the best out of the players. So that's why I feel like that's been the most obvious difference, I believe. But what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I mean, I also think it's very important for us not to put the cart before the horse here. Like, we've won 2 games, and it's very easy for us to get excited because of where we've come from. But, at the same time, we've got to make sure that we go in next week and play well against Scotland before we can even contemplate. Of course, we want to dream that the Grand Slam, but I mean, like imagine that this team was the first team in 40 years to win a Grand Slam for Australia after where we were 12 months ago. I mean, like crazy times, right? But Joe Schmidt, I think he's great. Like, I don't think the talent's been there. I just don't know if we're getting the best out of it, or we're getting the best collection of players playing together or playing a style that suited our players as opposed to the players having to suit a style. I think that's really big when you've got a certain, like Lenny Giteau wasn't at the World Cup. Harry Wilson, he's a captain now. He wasn't at the World Cup. Like there's all these players that had an abundance of talent. We just weren't utilising it the right way. And it almost like trying to, square peg in a round hole, like trying to get our players to fit a game plan that didn't suit us. And to Eddie's admission, it won't win us a World Cup this year. Like, who wants to go to a fucking World Cup when they're like, we won't win it this year, we'll win it in 4 years? I'm like, wait.
But also, not everyone gets the opportunity to go to 2 World Cups.
Yeah.
You may get injured. Anything could happen so close to that. So I think, and also you look at someone like Noah Lolosio. He was criticised heavily during that rugby championship. Most coaches probably would have moved on and tried someone different.
Yeah.
But they've stuck at him and they're repaying the faith. If you know a coach believes in you, especially as a game controller, if you know no matter what you do, he's going to believe in you. Like that just provides so much confidence for you, and you feel like you can really lead the boys around, and you're not going to, because he was chopping and changing every time. So every time if you feel like you're playing for your position, I feel like you're going to play safe.
Yeah.
Whereas if you know you're going to get picked, shackles are off. You're going to show what you got.
I said that. I've said whenever I've been asked it in interviews or media bits, whatever I've done, do you feel like competition for your place is good? And I've always said I've played my best rugby when I've known that I'm number one and I'm not going to get replaced the next week if I have a poor game. Clearly if you have 9, 10, 11 poor games on the spin, then things have got to be looked at. But for me, I love being number one and not being challenged for my position in those key positions. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I spoke to Noah after the game, and he was just exactly what you said. And do you know what? A really interesting point that you guys have made about, you mentioned about Karevi, Skelton, Suaalii, guys like that. It's not so much even their rugby ability. It's almost it's like the presence around the squad. If they're playing, not playing. And that's what I feel, in particular, Wales have lost massively after the World Cup in terms of a lot of experienced players and a lot of guys who've been around the block. And almost to a similar way, a little bit of England at the minute. They've lost their Owen Farrell, for argument's sake, who's their key guy, key leader.
Courtney Laws.
And in those, Courtney Laws as well. And in those key moments in the last 15, 20 minutes of the last 5 or 6 test matches, they've just come up a little bit short. So for me, speaking to Noah and touching base on your point, I just think characters in a squad and in an environment and on the pitch are so important. And almost probably Australia needed that more than rugby playing ability, in a sense. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I reckon also if you're behind, say the team scores against you and things aren't going well, you've got experienced players that are saying, fellas, it's fine. Don't worry about it. We'll go back there. They've got a game plan. Like you've been in that scenario before. Even just suiting up, you're in the change room, putting your boots on, you look around, you see some of the characters. And even if you're a bit nervous, you're like, oh, this guy, mate, he's a beast. Like this guy's a beast. And automatically you feel totally different. I think with Wales, obviously, not to sink the boot in, but when you're in that change room, if things turn bad, who do you turn to in that huddle, to get that experience, to get that leadership, to get you out of that hole and to give you confidence even when you're behind, So I think that's probably where that experience and these guys can add so much, even if they're off, even if they're not playing well. So, yeah, I agree with you totally.
Yeah, and the apprenticeship that a lot of these Australian lads have had. You mentioned Noah there. I know he's played before. Me and Goody were talking about on the pod earlier in the week about how good the championship is. And you look how good Argentina are. And watching Australia, I know some of the results. It was a big scoreline against Argentina away, 2 close games against the All Blacks. It felt closer than maybe the results said. And I tweeted and I said, I can see enough in Australia to show that there's a game plan, there's a kind of way in which they want to play, and it means a lot for them to play for Australia.
Yeah.
But you've got to go through it. I don't know whether, Biggs will get on to Wales, whether or not they can come through that, whether they've got the athletic players within that, but the athleticism and also the baptism of fire a lot of these have had of playing in the championship. Am I over talking the championship?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, you look at Argentina, like they're fucking beasts. Like they've come on a long way for probably since 2015 semi-finals of the World Cup there, and then they just sort of continued, and they just like they beat England in Twickenham, they beat New Zealand over there. Like like they're just ticking off some pretty significant milestones in their in this playing group's sort of resume, and off the back of that, they're getting so much confidence, and then I think then you look at sort of, we had some tough ones. We won away against Argentina, then we get spanked by them. Like South Africa and New Zealand, obviously, really tough. But, these guys, much like what Wales are going through now, like you don't want to have to go through those hard lessons, but it's so fucking important. Like you just got to, maybe you don't need to go through 11 games in the trot, but you got to take your licks. But you've got to, what you've got to do is make sure that there are the lessons that are there are actually being learnt. Because
do you know what?
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, we've just spoken about a load about like your Suaaliis, your Karevis, your Losalos, all these sort of, I suppose, bigger names in a sense. But do you know what I think? And your point, Jim, about how good the Rugby Championship has been. For me, what's been most impressive about Australia in the last couple of weeks has been their front five in terms of how they've dominated both games from that front five point of view, in my opinion. You look at your Jeremy Williams, your Frost, your Angus Bells, your Feslers. These guys have just, their maul's been excellent. They've been winning yards around the around the fringes, the hard yards and things like that. And for me, it's like you said, Jim, they've come off the back of playing South Africa twice, New Zealand twice, Argentina twice. So all of a sudden you're going into matches against, with all due respect, England and Wales were probably a little bit below, certainly Wales, a level below those guys. So they're able to impose themselves and a match ready and a match hardened type of thing. So for me, as much as we've spoken about how brilliant like your Tom Wrights, your Suaaliis and things have been, for me, the front five have just been brilliant, which clearly is going to be as important as anything come next year for the Lions tour.
I mean, I think Angus Bell's been an absolute standout for us. Like around the ground, he's bumping people, he's making line breaks. Like, I don't know if there's probably another prop in world rugby at the moment that's making as many line breaks as him. Obviously, Oxnation and these guys are, doing some great work around.
I was going to say,
No.
You actually finished it by saying who's making line breaks. If you would have said who's the best loose head in the world, the South Africans are going to hate you.
No.
We said Angus, though. We said Angus Bell at the minute.
I'm definitely not saying that. But what I'm like, Angus is, he's been a real standout for us and someone that we can really, almost trust to go out there and play. Anywhere from an 8 or 9 out of 10 each week. Whereas in a really brave call I felt this week was from Joe Schmidt not to play Teniela Tupou. Like he dropped it, and Zane Nongor comes on the bench, Alan Alaalatoa starts. But Teniela, he's a guy that's, the last few years been talked about being one of the best sort of, front rowers going around there. But he's just not at his level. So Joe Schmidt makes a hard call, doesn't play him, and then, the guys that step in do a good job.
Yeah, Biggs, we spoke about the forwards and the driving line out specifically, having not putting Australia in the boat where they're maulers and brawlers. They've got that in them now. Just to touch on the weekend, because we've got you, what are they saying now? What's been the aftermath of getting 50 points any which way against Australia at the weekend?
Well, I've had some tough days in my career in that Welsh shirt and at that stadium, but for me, that's as tough a watch as I've had in that stadium or feeling I've had after the match. It felt as if that was sort of the moment where I think everybody, even though we've been talking about it previously about the regions not being good enough, the team perhaps not being good enough, losing experience, etc. It felt like the moment that whistle went on Sunday afternoon felt like it was the moment where things had to change. Now, does that mean it's Gats leaving, moving on, etc.? I think that will happen, and I think that has to happen when you're the top guy and you've lost 11 games on the spin. But I don't think just getting rid of Warren Gatland is going to solve all of Wales's issues. You've got a team probably which isn't quite good enough at the minute to compete against the top teams. You've got an organisation which is probably not in sync and not aligned from top down to the bottom. But it did feel after Saturday, I think it wasn't so much anger. I think there was a little bit of anger in Wales the week before losing to Fiji. But I think it was a little bit of resignation on Sunday that this is where Wales are and it's going to take a little bit of time for them to get back to the top. And it was almost the worst opponents we could have played on Sunday, because you look at the transformation in an Australia. If you're in an Australia camp, compare that to 12 months ago. And compare that to what the feeling was in Wales after the World Cup, and they're just polar opposites, aren't they? So I think that for me made the biggest difference.
Yeah, you compare it even to 3-4 months ago when you toured Australia. You weren't at home, and you pushed us all the way to the death. Like I thought that the Maul was going to be like such a tough battle for us because in Australia in July we had no answers for that. Whereas we scored 3 more tries and there were none from Wales. Like
that's where you knew. That's what we were saying. That's when we knew, Biggs, there was nothing there.
I think that's why they picked Skelton, I think, to start on the weekend, because against Fiji, actually, Wales's Maul went really, really well again off the back of the 2 games in Australia against you guys. So I think that was, again, you look at Joe Schmidt, he seems just to be making the right decisions at the minute, doesn't he? I remember we were right in front of Wales's first Maul around the halfway line. Skelton just gets in there, literally just destroys it. First one of the game, scrum to Australia, and you sort of all of a sudden there's a bit of doubt then again. Do you know what I mean? So I just think that off the back of sort of everything sort of Joe Schmidt has done, he's managed to sort of turn things around, get the country, like you said, Drew, back on side a little bit, whereas the opposite has probably happened in Wales in the last 12 months.
Well, Biggs, everything you just explained about, like kind of that moment on Sunday after that game and the feeling of resignation and almost like the catalyst of like, okay, things need to, like that was us. That was us at the World Cup. Like as hard as it was and as disappointing and as sad and all the other emotions attached to it, in a funny way, it's kind of what we needed, because if we'd made it to a quarterfinal or snuck our way into a semi-final, it would have glossed over all these other things, all the other actual issues, because much to your point as well, like the coach alone wasn't the only issue with Rugby Australia, and it's certainly still not now. There's no one silver bullet, but had we just done a little bit better at that last year's World Cup, we probably would have glossed over a lot of things that needed to be looked at. So, if that was the straw to broke the camel's back, and it makes you actually look internally, make some hard decisions, and whatever the case may be. Like we were there, man. Like we were there 10 months ago.
I was gonna ask just Drew something really quickly. I spoke to a couple of the lads on Sunday. Saturday, I met them for a coffee in Cardiff, and they were saying, I was asking the question, how on earth do Rugby Australia pay Joseph Suaalii 1.6 million when there's cuts going on everywhere, teams going under, etc. I just think it may be quite interesting for people who don't quite know the dynamics of Rugby Australia to sort of understand how that kind of works.
Yeah, well, I mean, the decision to get Joseph Suaalii as the chairman, Hamish McLennan, who's now moved on, and I think a lot of people scoffed at the amount that we paid. I don't think anyone ever questioned that he's going to be a good athlete and a good player, because I think it's pretty evident that he's going to be, right? But I think the amount was probably, questioned quite heavily. But then I guess off the back of it, in some ways it's vindicated, because we're in a really competitive market against rugby league, for example. A lot of our sporting lovers watch rugby league and are conditioned by rugby league when they watch rugby union. So, a highlight reel hit in rugby league is a yellow card or a red card in rugby union, so they think the game's soft. If there's too much kicking, that's where some negativity comes in. A lot of our viewers, especially just sort of the sporting fans, are conditioned by rugby league. And then, but what Joseph's been able to provide is coverage in mainstream media. Like Wallabies winning or losing all these test matches throughout the course of the year sometimes wouldn't even make our sports report on channel 6. Oh, sorry, 6 p.m. news. But now Joseph Suaalii is the first story in the sport report, right? So all of a sudden we're engaging more people. It's getting us out there a little bit. So much so that Peter V'landys, who's the chairman of the Rugby League, has apparently inquired into how much the broadcaster Channel 9 is reporting about rugby union. Like he doesn't like that he sees us as a competitor, rugby union against rugby league. Doesn't like how much coverage we're getting, so he's making inquiries to make sure that they cut back a little bit. So that's kind of the I guess the flow on, the knock-on effect for having someone like Joseph Suaalii who comes in his first game. Look, he's a great player. He's a good-looking fellow. He's charismatic. He's articulate. He goes out there and
he's a beast.
Exactly.
Did you see him? Like, it's the first time that I've actually seen him. I did like the pre-game TV. Saw him up close. I was going, oh.
Yeah. That's just sort of the impact that someone like Joseph Suaalii can have. He's getting people talking about it and watching and engaging with the game.
I think everything you said is spot on, and you kind of need that. I suppose the second part, or the part of the question, which may be interesting for the listeners as well, is how do Rugby Australia actually afford that, considering where they're actually at? Is it a private sponsor, or is it a sponsorship deal?
Question.
Mate, and honestly, I don't know. There's been talk about like a bit of a war chest from some private wealth and guys and girls, and I'm not too sure where they're coming from, but that love the game and providing X amount to dip into. I mean, there's been talk of that, but been no confirmation of it. Whether it's an advancement, I know that Hamish McLennan as well, when the chairman, I think they borrowed at $60 or $80 million last year as well. So I don't know if we're just dipping in ourselves a bit further into debt, and they see this as a way of maybe getting some of that back.
I don't want to go too big on the guy, but I don't remember a moment like this with a player. Maybe Sonny Bill Williams back in the day, but like modern rugby where football's taken over, NFL, NBA, and the whole push is away from union. And we've got this young 21-year-old lad coming in, Joseph, and within 2 weeks... it's blown up for him. And so you think commercially, and I don't know what they'll do with like shirt sales, like very superficial, name on the back of the shirt. Yeah. But I imagine when he goes home, everyone's going to know who he is.
Oh. Well, they already do, but
I'd never heard of it. I like a bit of it.
Of course. But what happens? I think he's an amazing talent, and he's a freak. You look at him; he's got all the attributes. I just don't want to build him up where we expect him to be a 10 out of 10 game breaker. He's played one test for Australia. He's had one professional game in rugby union. He did super well. I reckon defensively, maybe he had a couple of not dodgy reads, but it's just like there were a couple of reads where you could expose him. And I think this also
that's why he's probably benched. Yeah.
That's where I reckon Joe Schmidt, he's smart. Wales would have prepared all week to target that 13 channel. Then when the team's announced, which it's usually on a Thursday, you've wasted 3 days of prep. Now Len Giteau, who's a normal 13, is defending at 13. So you now can't attack that channel. With Joey, though, I think he's a phenomenal talent. I just don't he's going to be great, but I just don't want everyone to expect so much from him where it gets to a point where he has a bad game and go, oh, there's that. What a waste of money. He's a one-game wonder or whatever. We just give him time and he'll eventually be a great player. Yeah. But to your point, we needed a superstar. You need someone where you look at the team list or kids want to be like this Joseph Suaalii. Okay, so I want to be like him. Where's he play? Rugby. Okay, now grassroots rugby will become more popular. At the moment, everyone's playing rugby league. Soccer's huge. My boys hate rugby. My two kids hate it. And you don't blame them because there's nothing really advertised. There's nothing out there before this tour. Since he's come, honestly, the landscape of rugby has changed where even rugby league podcasters are talking about, are the Wallabies back? Are we back to our glory days? It's only been 2 games.
I know.
We've got to settle down a little bit.
Commercial masterstroke, though. I know he's a player, he's an athlete, but all the talk around that.
Absolutely, I agree with you, yes.
Yeah.
Especially with what's coming up in the summer as well, isn't it? Where you want to make it a huge event for Australia once every 12 years. It's, it'll pay for itself 10 times over if they get really.
If when they come and they travel and everyone's getting excited, the money that Australian rugby potentially can make off the British and Irish Lions, and if we do well, builds more excitement than for the World Cup. Because we're hosting the next World Cup, then the Women's World Cup. So financially, it could be massive for us.
Yeah, they always spoke about this being a golden decade for us, but it was always the potential for a golden decade if we harness it well and we maximise the opportunities that a Lions series, a home World Cup men's, a home World Cup women's, and 2032 Olympics in Brisbane. There's some big global events that rugby in Australia are going to be involved in, and the podcast, of course. Yeah. We've got to fucking milk those little teats as well. But we've got to make those good decisions to maximise it. And when I say we, like the Rugby Australia and the powers to be, to really cut through what is a really competitive market.
I was one of those, not a Ben Youngs, but I was one of those where I thought it was going to be tough for Australia with the Lions going over there. And I think I'm blinded by a lot of people, the same as a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere, by the bias that we have up here that Ireland, France, Scotland, England, we're now better than the Southern Hemisphere. The World Cup showed that isn't the case. But with Australia, it felt like, well, the Lions are going to go there. Ireland, number one team in the world. Yep. Scotland will have a few players. England will be all right. So we think, so we hope. We know that Wales are struggling. We've already mentioned that as well. But it felt like it was a foregone conclusion that the Lions were going to go down to Australia. And I think a few people are shocked, but it has really...
changed the perspective.
It's changed everything, and I don't want to say it's saved rugby. It's a big old statement.
Yeah.
Were you worried, or were you always thinking that it could have been turned around, you're going to be fine against the Lions?
Yeah, I would have been confident that Joe Schmidt, we just had to be patient. Like we've been saying for a long time, it's got to be like, give us some time, give these players some time, be patient. I think whilst it's disappointing for the Rebels supporters that there's no Rebels next year, I think it's made our Super Rugby teams stronger because those players have now found their way into the other 4 Super Rugby teams. So all of a sudden, we're going to be more competitive at Super Rugby competition next year, which off the back of that might breed a little bit of confidence, all that sort of stuff. Like I just felt there was enough time for us before the Lions series to be competitive. And, you know, if from what people were saying, it was going to be a 3-0 whitewash, but also by significant scores. I'm not going to sit here right now and predict what the score, like what the series outcome is going to be.
Oh, go on.
But yeah, but it'll be 3-0 to Australia. But I was always confident they were going to be competitive games, and yeah, so that's why I think sometimes, and you know, again, maybe it's our bias, right? Like when I sat there and I heard some of those comments, I'd take it personally. I'm like, fuck off, like. Say that we don't deserve to host something, you know, like, but and who are we to sit here and say who deserves something? Like, you know, a privilege that's been historic and it's something that's been there. And if this isn't a successful one for the tour in itself, like it means the next one in 12 years' time is even more significant. Like you don't change it just because a team's not going well in the now. Like,
yeah, I mean, also when Ben Youngs he said what he said, I thought, what an absolute flog. Like, you know, it didn't matter. We had him on our pod yesterday, so it's all good now. We're great friends. But I think during the Rugby Championship in particular, Joe Schmidt just chose local players. See, so he just chose the ones that were staying in Australian rugby, playing Super Rugby there, which I think was really good because you're rewarding the guys that are showing, not that the ones that left haven't showed loyalty to the jersey. That's not what I'm saying. But the ones that are staying there, playing there, they get first right at the jersey. And he stuck with them for that Rugby Championship. Now we've added 3 or 4, not a massive amount, but it's added a huge amount to the squad. And it doesn't have to be from a playing point of view, what we spoke about earlier. It's just experience. It's a training. Nick Frost, the way he played on the weekend, I'm certain that's off the back of Will Skelton coming in, putting pressure on him at training, doing different things. Like you want to prove yourself. It's like when we first went to Toulon, you're surrounded by superstars and you want to prove that Australia is just as good. So my 100 caps or 90 caps for Australia when I first got to Toulon, that's as good as Johnny's. Well, it's way better than Johnny's 60 or whatever he got for England. But you're surrounded by superstars and you want to prove yourself. So when you bring in guys that you respect, and you want their respect back, you lift a level. So I think that's where the big improvement's been by adding these players.
I think that's what we sort of spoke about earlier, Gits, wasn't it? In terms of like those characters and personalities. Forget about actually on the playing field for 80 minutes. It's that training week. It's that intensity, the levels, like you've just said, and bringing people up to that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like it's as small as looking across in a team huddle or in a dressing room and you see a Wycliffe Palu or a David Pocock and you think, fuck, all right, we're going to be all right. Like,
or a Jim Hamilton.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I just didn't have that opportunity to I mean, I'm getting in here. I'm like, yeah, this podcast, we're all right. We're going to go all right.
We're all right. We're humble.
But, you know, like it can be something as small as that, just having the presence and their aura and just to go, you know what? We got this guy. We're going to, like, things are going to go all right. Like, because they've just got, mate, imagine looking across and you're seeing 155 kilo Will Skelton and he's got his arm around you, like, and he's kind of got that demeanour where he's
155.
I played with Will. He's the biggest human. He's not as big as Molfol for France. I mean, they're very similar sizes of human beings.
Yeah. But like how can you not feel protected? Like, we got this, you know, like
pod. Rugby pod.